January 21, 1942, the Russian interior, 300 miles south of Leningrad. The mercury in the thermometers has retreated past the -40°C mark, freezing the oil in machine guns and turning the breath of dying men into a crystalline fog. In the ancient town of Chom, situated at the confluence of the Lovett and Kunya rivers, the silence of the great Russian winter is not peaceful. It is a predatory wait. Beneath the jagged remains of a medieval church tower, Major General Theodor Scherer adjusts his greatcoat, the wool stiff with frozen mud. The report from the perimeter is final. The last road to the west has been severed by the Soviet Third Shock Army. 6,000 men, a fractured mosaic of mountain troops, reserve police, and Luftwaffe ground crews are now compressed into a pocket barely 2 kilometers wide. They are surrounded by an ocean of white forest and a Red Army fueled by the vengeful momentum of the winter counteroffensive. There are no trenches, only shallow pits hacked into the permafrost with explosives and pickaxes. The command from the high-altitude radio crackles with the weight of a death sentence. Festing, you are a fortress. There is no permission to break out, and there is no path for retreat. In this moment, the tactical map of the Eastern Front narrows down to a single, bloody dot on the map. For the men of Kampfgruppe Scherer, the world has shrunk to the distance they can see through a frosted rifle scope. They have been told to hold until they are relieved, or until the snow claims them as part of the landscape. The Great Winter Crisis. December 1941, January 1942. To understand the isolation of the men at Chom, one must first understand the catastrophic collapse of the German dream of a swift victory in the East. By December 1941, the German Wehrmacht was a spent force. The lightning war blitzkrieg, which had consumed Poland, France, and the Balkans, had finally ground to a halt in the sucking mud and paralyzing frosts of the Russian interior. Operation Barbarossa had reached its high-water mark at the gates of Moscow, where the spires of the Kremlin were visible to German reconnaissance units, only to be met by a wall of Siberian divisions and a climate that felt like a sentient enemy. On December 5th, the Soviet Union launched its massive winter counteroffensive. It was not merely a local push. It was a 1,000-mile-wide tidal wave of steel and fur-clad infantry. For the first time in the Second World War, the German army was not just stopped, it was being routed. General Zhukov's forces smashed through the overextended German lines, threatening to encircle entire army groups. In the north, the situation was particularly precarious. Army Group North, tasked with the capture of Leningrad, found its southern flank dangling in the air, exposed to the vast, swampy forests between Lake Ilmen and the Valdai Hills as the German 16th Army attempted to stabilize a front that was rapidly disintegrating. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, identified a critical junction. The town of Chom was a vital transportation hub. It sat at the intersection of several key roads and the Lovett River. If the Soviets could seize Chom, they could sever the lateral communications between Army Group North and Army Group Center, creating a gap hundreds of miles wide. The Red Army's Third Shock Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Maxim Perkiev, was ordered to bypass the main German strongpoints and drive a wedge deep into the German rear. By mid-January 1942, the German retreat had become a desperate struggle for survival. Soldiers who had spent the summer marching in triumph were now huddled in hedgehog defenses, isolated pockets of resistance centered on villages and road junctions. They were short on winter clothing, short on fuel, and dangerously short on ammunition. The Luftwaffe, hampered by the weather, could barely keep the front line supplied, let alone provide air cover for a retreating infantry. In the center of this brewing storm lay Chom. It was not a grand fortress of stone and steel. It was a town of wooden houses and a few brick administrative buildings. Yet, by the third week of January, it became the anchor for the entire sector. If Chom fell, the Soviet Third Shock Army would pour into the German rear like water through a broken dam. The stage was set for a collision between Soviet momentum and German desperation. The crucible of the pocket. January 18th, January 21st, 1942. As the Soviet Third Shock Army surged forward. The German High Command, the Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, realized that a complete withdrawal from the Lovett River sector would lead to a catastrophic collapse of the entire northern front. Adolf Hitler, now personally commanding the army, issued his infamous Stand Fast order. No retreats were permitted. Towns were to be held as wave breakers to shatter the momentum of the Soviet tide. Chom was the most critical of these wave breakers. To hold it, a haphazard collection of units was funneled into the town's perimeter. This was not an elite panzer division. It was Kampfschreiber. It consisted of the 281st Security Division men, usually tasked with rear area duties, elements of the 123rd Infantry Division, and a mountain of stragglers who had been separated from their original units during the retreat. There were sailors from river flotillas and even members of the Ordnungspolizei, reserve police. By January 19th, the Soviet pincers began to close. The Red Army's 33rd Rifle Division, supported by tank brigades, bypassed the town to the north and south, cutting the vital supply road to Lokia. The German soldiers inside Chom could hear the thunder of Soviet artillery growing louder from all directions. They watched as the last horse-drawn supply wagons raced into the town under a hail of sniper fire. On the morning of January 21st, the ring was sealed. Inside the pocket, the reality was grim. There were no prepared bunkers, only cellar holes and the ruins of wooden izbas. The fortress was a circle with a diameter of barely 1.5 miles. Within this tiny bullseye, nearly 6,000 men were trapped with only the ammunition they carried and whatever could be scavenged from the town as small depots. They were surrounded by 3 Soviet rifle divisions and 2 tank brigades. On paper, the odds were impossible. To the Soviet commanders, Chom was a minor obstacle to be crushed in 48 hours. They did not yet realize that the men inside had transitioned from a retreating mob into a collective that understood one thing. If they lost the town, there was nowhere to go but the Siberian gulags or a shallow grave in the snow. The siege of Chom was no longer a tactical maneuver. It had become a test of human endurance against the absolute limit of physical possibility. The stage was now set for a 5-month struggle that would defy every rule of 20th century warfare. The tactical angle, the anatomy of a urban death trap. Tactically, the defense of Chom was a nightmare of geometry. Most fortresses in military history rely on high ground or reinforced concrete. Chom had neither. The town sat in a low-lying basin, meaning the Soviet artillery observers on the surrounding hills could look down into almost every street and courtyard. To survive, General Scherer transformed the town into a spiderweb defense. Rather than a solid front line which would have been obliterated by the superior Soviet numbers, the Germans created a series of mutually supporting strongpoints in the basements of stone buildings. Communication between these nests was nearly impossible. Runners had to dash across open snow-covered squares swept by sniper fire. Every house became a mini Alamo. When the Soviets breached one building, the Germans didn't retreat. They simply moved to the cellar or the attic and fought until the structure collapsed. This island tactic forced the Red Army to pay for every meter in blood, turning the town's compact size into an advantage for the defenders, who could shift their meager reserves internally much faster than the Soviets could rotate their massive divisions on the outside. The technological angle, the Junkers' lifeline. If the tactical defense was the heart of Chom, the air bridge was its lungs. Without a single functioning airfield inside the pocket, the garrison was entirely dependent on the Luftwaffe's ability to drop supplies by parachute or land Ru-52 transport planes on a makeshift, 600-meter strip of frozen dirt that was constantly under shell fire. This was the precursor to the more famous and failed air bridge at Stalingrad. The technology was primitive. Supply canisters or Versorgungsbomben often drifted into Soviet lines or shattered upon impact in the ruins. The Ru-52 anti-Ru transports were slow. Lumbering targets for Soviet flak and the rising presence of the Red Air Force, mechanics worked in sub-zero temperatures, using blowtorches to thaw frozen engines while pilots navigated through whiteout blizzards. The leadership angle, the iron will of Theodor Scherer in the frozen ruins of Chom. The personality of one man dictated the survival of thousands. Major General Theodor Scherer was not a career aristocrat of the old Prussian school. He was a gritty, pragmatic commander who understood that in a pocket, Morale is more valuable than ammunition. Scherer's leadership style was one of visibility. He did not command from a distant bunker. He was frequently seen in the frontline cellars, his face blackened by soot, sharing the same horse-meat broth as his private soldiers. Scherer's greatest challenge was psychological. He had to convince men who were starving, frostbitten, and surrounded that they were not forgotten. When the Soviet propaganda loudspeakers blared across the snow, promising warm food and safety to any German who surrendered, Scherer countered with a relentless focus on duty and the promise of the air bridge. He fostered a Chom identity, a sense of belonging to an elite brotherhood of the damned. This iron-fisted resolve prevented the panic that usually disintegrates surrounded units. By the time the siege reached its third month, the men weren't fighting for National Socialism or even for Germany. They were fighting for Scherer and for each other. The human angle, the hunger and the cold beyond the maps and the generals, the siege was a visceral struggle against the elements. By February, the food situation reached a critical breaking point. The daily ration was slashed to a few ounces of bread, often stretched with sawdust, and a thin soup made from the carcasses of the garrison's horses. When the last horse was eaten, the men began to hunt for anything that moved. Scurvy and typhus began to stalk the cellars alongside Soviet snipers. The cold was a constant, silent killer. Men slept in shifts to prevent freezing to death, huddled together in the basements of bombed-out buildings. Without proper medical supplies, surgeons performed amputations with carpenter's saws and no anesthesia, as gangrene turned frostbitten toes and fingers black. Yet, even in this misery, a strange culture emerged. The soldiers began to take pride in their filth and their resilience. They became the ghosts of Chom. Men who had moved past the fear of death because they lived in a landscape where death was the only constant. This human endurance, pushed to the absolute breaking point, transformed a minor tactical delay into a legendary stand that defied every biological limit. The Easter Massacre. April 1942. By the spring of 1942, the fortress of Chom had been reduced to a skeletal ruin. The thaw, or Rasputitsa, had turned the snow into a waist-deep slurry of mud and human remains, making the air bridge more treacherous than ever. But for the Soviet Third Shock Army, the persistence of Kampfgruppe Scherer was an intolerable insult to the Red Army's winter successes. On the morning of April 5th, Easter Sunday, the Soviet command launched what they intended to be the final, crushing blow. The bombardment began at dawn. Over 100 Soviet artillery pieces and heavy mortar opened fire on a perimeter that was now less than a mile wide. It was a drum-fire barrage designed to pulverize the last standing brick in Chom. Following the steel rain, the Soviet infantry surged forward from all directions, supported by the terrifying silhouette of KV-1 heavy tanks. These steel giants, nearly impervious to the German 37mm Dornacher anti-tank guns, rumbled directly over German foxholes, crushing men into the mud. The fighting devolved into a primal house-to-house struggle. In the GPU prison building, a key German strongpoint, the defenders fought with bayonets, sharpened entrenching tools, and hand grenades at point-blank range. There were no front lines anymore. The battle was a series of disconnected, screaming whirlpools of violence. By noon, the Soviets had pierced the northern sector of the town, threatening to split the pocket in two. Scherer, suffering from wounds himself, committed his last reserves, a scratch company of walking wounded and naval personnel. They managed to halt the Soviet tanks using improvised sticky bombs and bundles of grenades, fighting with a ferocity that bordered on the suicidal. The Easter assault failed, leaving the streets choked with the burning husks of Soviet armor and the gray-clad batas of German defenders. But the fortress was now bleeding out the final siege and the iron relief. May 5th, 1942. By May 1st, the situation inside the Chom pocket had transitioned from desperate to terminal. The spring thaw had turned the tiny perimeter into a literal swamp of mud, unburied corpses, and open craters. Of the original 6,000 men, barely 1,200 were still capable of holding a rifle. General Scherer's command post was now under direct machine gun fire from Soviet positions less than 100 yards away. The air bridge was failing. The improvised landing strip was so churned by shells that transport planes could no longer land. Supplies were dropped by parachute, but many drifted into the Lovett River or the Soviet lines. The Soviet Third Shock Army, humiliated by the Germans' refusal to die, prepared one final overwhelming general assault. On May 3rd, the Soviet artillery began a bombardment of such intensity that it leveled the remaining chimneys and walls that had served as German snipers' nests. Following the barrage, 5 Soviet infantry regiments and a fresh tank brigade slammed into the German lines. The fortress was now so small that Soviet mortar could reach from one side of the pocket to the other. In the northeastern sector, the German police battalion was nearly annihilated, fighting in the ruins of the town's schoolhouse with nothing but hand grenades and captured Russian submachine guns. But as the Soviet infantry surged into the town's center, a new sound began to vibrate through the mud, the heavy, rhythmic thrum of Maybach engines. To the west, a relief force known as Gruppe Cap, centered around the 122nd Infantry Division and supported by Stu 3 assault guns, had finally punched through the outer Soviet ring. For 5 months, the relief attempts had stalled in the Russian forests, but now, fueled by the desperation of their trapped comrades, the panzers tore through the final Soviet blocking positions. On the morning of May 5, 1942, the leading elements of the relief column reached the outskirts of Chom. The first German soldiers to break through didn't find a triumphant garrison. They found a collection of hollow-eyed, skeletal figures who looked more like ghosts than soldiers. The siege, which was supposed to last 48 hours, had lasted 105 days. The impossible had been achieved. But the cost was written in the blackened ruins of the town and the thousands of shallow graves that lined its shattered streets. The toll of the hedgehog. May 1942, when the first relief tanks of the 122nd Infantry Division finally clattered into the central square of Chom, they did not find a functioning city. They found a graveyard of brick and splintered timber. The fortress had been reduced to a footprint of rubble less than 1.5 miles wide. Of the approximately 6,000 men who had been trapped in the initial encirclement in January, only about 1,200 remained fit for combat. Over 1,500 lay dead in the frozen soil, and another 2,200 were severely wounded, many suffering from the dual horrors of shrapnel and advanced frostbite. The medical reality was a scene of medieval carnage. In the final weeks, the German surgeons had run out of bandages, using paper and even torn curtains to bind wounds. Scurvy had caused the teeth of young men to fall out, and the lack of vitamins made skin as brittle as parchment. The Chom face, a term later used by military doctors, described the 1,000-yard stare of the survivors, eyes sunken into blackened sockets, skin stretched tight over bone, and a permanent, twitching alertness to the sound of incoming mortar fire. The Soviet losses were even more staggering. In their obsession with crushing the pocket, the Third Shock Army had dashed entire divisions against the ruins. Estimates suggest that for every German soldier killed in the pocket, the Red Army lost 7 or 8. Dozens of T-34 and KV-1 tanks sat rusted and gutted in the streets, monuments to a tactical failure. To the German High Command, the survival of Kampfrupschüre was a propaganda miracle. Hitler personally authorized the Chom Shield, a unique combat decoration to be worn on the left sleeve, featuring an eagle perched above a map of the town. It became one of the rarest and most respected awards in the Wehrmacht, a mark of a man who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink, the strategic mirage. June 1942, 1943. While the relief of Chom was celebrated as a triumph of the German soldier's spirit, its long-term strategic impact was far more insidious. The survival of Kampfrupschüre taught Adolf Hitler a dangerous and ultimately fatal lesson. He became convinced that fortress positions isolated, pockets of troops ordered to stand their ground regardless of encirclement, could tie down superior Soviet forces indefinitely, provided they were supplied by air. This hedgehog doctrine worked at Chom because the pocket was small and the Soviet anti-aircraft net was still maturing. However, it created a false sense of security within the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW. The success of the Chom air bridge became the blueprint for the disastrous attempt to supply the Sixth Army at Stalingrad later that year. At Stalingrad, the scale was vastly different. Instead of 6,000 men in a 2-kilometer circle, there were 250,000 men spread across a wasteland. The Luftwaffe, bled white by the effort at Chom and the subsequent Demyansk pocket, simply could not repeat the miracle on a grand scale. For the survivors of Chom, the Iron Relief brought only a temporary reprieve. After a brief period of convalescence and the awarding of their shields, many were funneled back into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. The town itself remained in German hands for nearly 2 more years, a scarred and desolate landmark in a war that had moved on to even greater scales of destruction. By the time the Red Army finally recaptured the ruins of Chom in early 1944, the men who had defended it in the winter of 42 were mostly dead or captured in subsequent battles. The fortress had been held, but the war it was meant to win was already slipping through the fingers of the Third Reich. The ghost of the fortress. History often remembers the great territorial sweeps, the massive tank battles across the steppes, or the fall of capital cities. But the siege of Chom reminds us that the true nature of war is often found in the stationary, the stagnant, and the suffocating. For 105 days, a tiny dot on a map became the center of the world for 6,000 men, who were told that their lives were less important than the ground they stood upon. Chom was more than a tactical anomaly. It was a testament to the terrifying adaptability of the human spirit. It proved that when retreat is removed from the equation, the human mind enters a state of primal preservation that defies logistics, biology, and the crushing weight of superior numbers. The men of Kampfrupschurer survived not because of superior technology, but because of a collective, desperate refusal to vanish into the snow. However, the legacy of Chom is double-edged. It remains a masterclass in defensive resilience, but it also served as a siren song for the German High Command. It provided a lethal illusion of invincibility that would eventually lead hundreds of thousands of other soldiers into the death traps of Stalingrad and the Cherkasy Pocket. It taught the world that a fortress is not built of stone, but of the men inside it, and yet even the strongest human fortress eventually crumbles when the tide of history turns. Today, the Lovett River flows past a rebuilt town, the scars of 1942 hidden beneath layers of modern life. But for those who study the echoes of the Eastern Front, Chom remains a chilling reminder of what happens when the order to stand fast meets the absolute limit of human endurance. It was a victory of the will, achieved in a landscape where victory was never supposed to be possible.